Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today's Stay In and Speak Out for Climate Action and Justice in Every Breath. I'm Vanessa Lynch, the Pennsylvania Field Organizer for Moms Clean Air Force. Moms Clean Air Force in Pennsylvania is a community of over 100,000 moms and dads united against air pollution and committed to fighting for climate safety to protect our children's health. As parents, we care deeply about climate change and want action from our elected officials. Moms are uniting to make this issue a top priority. We are talking about this in virtual meetings with our national and state elected officials across the country this summer. Climate change is real. It's happening now, and it threatens the health of my children. I consider it part of my job as a mom to protect my children from climate change. I am deeply concerned that we're running out of time to do something about this crisis. Moms are fierce protectors of our children's health. We know that air pollution and climate change harm our kids. That's why we're coming together to demand a solution to the climate crisis. Right now, we're watching the living breath being taken from Black people over and over again in so many different ways. Communities of color are bearing the brunt of police brutality as well as the COVID crisis. And these same communities breathe significantly more air pollution than others. It is time for all of us to work toward justice in every breath. I want to welcome my co-host for today's event. Sitting next to me is my son, Gavin. Gavin, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Gavin. I'm 11 years old. I like to dance, ride my bike, read, and hang out with my friends. I'm excited to be here and show how kids can help make an impact on climate change.
Thanks, Gavin. Also joining me today are Lois Bauer Bjornson with Plein Air Council and her daughter, Odessa.
Hello. Hi, thanks, Vanessa. We're so excited to be here. I am the Southwestern Pennsylvania Field Organizer with Plein Air Council, and I work directly with impacted community members, my family included, as we are impacted living here in Washington County, Pennsylvania. Odessa?
Hi, I'm Odessa. I'm 10 years old, and I really like to dance and go outside and explore nature. I'm excited to be here because I really want to acknowledge this terrible pollution problem that's going on in our world today. So,
thanks, ladies. Now I'd like to introduce Representative Sara Innamorato, representing Pennsylvania's District 21. We're so happy to have such an amazing climate champion join us tonight.
Thank you so much, everyone. I am so happy to be here. And for folks who don't know, the 21st District is located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So I have parts of the city and then Northern Allegheny County. And I feel like I want to take a little lead into what Odessa did and tell people my name's Sarah. I'm 34 years old. I'm a lifelong Pittsburgher. I like to spend some of my time learning to play the ukulele. And on Wednesdays, I like to ride my bike across a bridge because Pittsburgh has a lot of them. And I pick up my local CSA. So I got to do that before I got on the call with everyone. So I feel like I got my muscles moving. My fridge is full of local produce that was bound for a dumpster. So, that's how that's my little carve out I do every Wednesday. But, in a much more serious note, so as a state representative, you are on the ground. You are essentially the front line for people to interact with state government. And so the fact that we have a global pandemic on top of an economic catastrophe, on top of all of the other crises that are deeply embedded in our society, structural racism, lack of health care, wage stagnation, disinvestment in our public sector, and housing instability, all of that is undergirded by our environmental crisis that we're currently experiencing. You understand how people's lives are being impacted. Since the start of this crisis, we've gotten thousands of calls from people who are often asking for help for the first time. And it's an opportunity for us to keep at the top of mind how lack of government action harms all of us, and our lack of investment in our public sector wreaks and has wreaked havoc for quite some time. So with all of these crises, it did not make the environmental crisis go away, it just exemplified it. And it really laid bare all of the inequities and injustices that have been prevalent in American society for quite some time, and really shown us that when we have a government that's filled with people who don't understand the pain and suffering, who have often gone to the highest bidder, the people who have given the highest campaign contribution, that we get policies, even in times of devastation, that center the needs of industry and billionaires over people who are really struggling, our working people, our frontline and essential workers. And so as we kind of go into this conversation this evening, I want to keep in mind that we are dealing, nothing that we were dealing with has gone away, as all of you know, because we've been doing this work for quite some time. But really, we're thinking about how do we help people in this moment and help keep them afloat, and also address use this as an opportunity to not only just come back, but to overhaul and build a society that's more resilient and can actually start to move us towards justice and address these issues. So I'm so happy to discuss all of those things with y'all tonight.
Awesome. So let's start with our first question. We've been seeing the expertise of mainstream scientists be set aside in order to discount the severity of climate change and air pollution. How can we ensure that scientific knowledge forms the basis of Pennsylvania's approach to climate change and public health protection, rather than corporate polluters and special interests?
I love this question. Because I think a lot of times it's not the lack of imagination, but it's rather the lack of political courage that prevents us from getting things done. And oftentimes the political courage and political will is stifled because of the people who can write the biggest checks. So I always tell folks to follow the money. And once you follow the money, you can understand who is actually guiding the agenda for our elected officials who are currently in office. We've signed a pledge to take no fossil fuel money. So we like to say we are a free agent, we're independent. And part of that is understanding that writing really strong legislation means that you bring people who are not only impacted by the issues at hand, but also are the experts in it, including scientists. So we've really tried to model this spirit of co-governing in our office, which means that we proactively reach out to scientists and investigative reporters and people who live in the shadow of frac wells, for example, to actually come together and write legislation that gets into the nitty-gritty and the nuance of codes, so that we can actually make something that can be transformational for communities. So I think really it's about asking whether your representatives have spoken to scientists and whether they believe them. And also, if you do have that expertise, whether it's a scientist, whether it's a public health expert, or whether it's someone who has been negatively impacted by our environmental crisis, sharing your story and sharing your knowledge with your elected representative is so vital. So if you don't know who your representatives are, by the end of the evening, I will make sure of it and schedule a meeting with them and have a discussion on the climate crisis and how it's impacted you and your family.
One of my best friends has asthma. Because we live with fracking in our community, I worry about him and how the air pollution from fracking could affect his breathing. What are you doing to clean up our air?
That is such a good question. And I'm so sorry to hear about your friend. You can let him know that I too have asthma. I was diagnosed when I was 2.5 years old and have been managing it most of my life. And so I know when it's really scary when you can't breathe and you're really trying to find your inhaler and what that means. And I think something else we have to think about outside of the environment is that most of the people or people who have asthma and these other chronic conditions, if we tie our healthcare to employment, there are times in my life where I haven't had healthcare. So I haven't been able to go see the medical doctors who can help me and prescribe me medicine to help manage my asthma. And so we have to think about how all of these things are so deeply, deeply interconnected. And it's really important for me to manage my asthma because we live in one of the areas with some of the poorest air quality. So Pittsburgh and the surrounding region, according to the American Lung Association, we have received failing grades nearly every year that they've done this report. And so it's something that, you know, we can't hide from. We have the data. We know that our air quality is poor and that we have the opportunity to do better. But it's really hard to convince people because long before I was born and you were born, we were the steel center, steel capital of the United States, of the world, and there was really heavy, thick smoke. And so, you know, people who are alive back then see the air now and they're like, well, it looks a lot better. But now we know that industry has, they have the pollution and the emissions, it looks a lot different, but it's still really negatively impacting our health and well-being. So one of the things that we're really looking at is and questioning is our regulatory environment. Right now, when industry wants to operate, and industry is the largest source of pollution in our region, you know, they have to go through, they have to get a permit, but that permit doesn't garner any agreement with the community on saying they're going to monitor certain things, or they're going to let them know what they're emitting or what waste they're producing and where that's going to go. There's not this level of transparency and collaboration. And then if someone gets sick, then it's up to the community to justify that they've been hurt by this particular industry operating in their own backyard. And that seems kind of backwards, right? Like you're putting you're essentially creating this David and Goliath situation where you have the people with all the money getting the permit, and then you have the little guys, you know, us trying to fight them and prove that they're causing harm and getting them to stop causing harm, where instead it should center the people who live, play, and work around industry. And the burden of proof should be on the industry, saying that we are safe, we are in compliance, and you know, we have an agreement with this community that if we do not hold up our end of the bargain, then you know, there is some legal action that the community can take in order to enforce the laws in that agreement.
So I have a question for you. For over a decade now, Pennsylvanians have been suffering from the impacts of the unconventional oil and gas industry, otherwise known as fracking. And recently this has come to light through the Pennsylvania Attorney General Josh Shapiro's grand jury investigation into the handling of fracking in the state and his charges of environmental crimes committed by the oil and gas companies. So as a resident of the most heavily fracked county in Pennsylvania, Washington County, we can't continue to put our children's health and their futures at risk. So how will you ensure that my voice and the 1.5 million people in Pennsylvania who live within a half mile of oil and gas facilities are heard? And then also, how will you hold corporate polluters in our state government agencies accountable to protect Pennsylvanians' health from the inherent risk of these industrial operations?
Yeah. So I actually don't tell the story a lot, but how I got involved in the environmental movement, maybe 10 years ago or so, it was right out of college. And it was because I saw Josh Fox's documentary in the basement of one of our local grocery stores. And it was infuriating. And that's really what kind of led me to being more involved and more conscious about everything, or all my personal actions, but then ultimately led me to this position as state representative, because understanding that we actually need individual actions are great and they add up to big things, but ultimately we need policy change and protections for people. And you're absolutely right that the oil and gas industry has been capitalizing on our community's natural resources for far more than a decade. And they're responsible for poisoning our community members and not being held accountable. That AG's report, it was a long time coming. And, I'm entering my second year in office, so I'm still fairly new in my first term. And I'm just so impressed with the amount of organizing that individuals have been doing around this issue. And also deeply disappointed in the fact that the majority of the conversation for a long time has been coming from the people who are impacted and not from our elected leaders and elected offices. So I think the fact that this report came out is reassuring and saying that, like, finally we're shining a light on this and giving it the attention that it deserves. Currently, our legislature is majority Republican, and the majority party has, prevented a lot of bills from being heard on the floor. And that's kind of the power dynamic that exists right now. And advocating for the environment and public health has traditionally been a Democratic priority. But, we're seeing more and more that, bipartisan support for environmental regulations that protect public health is not coming to the floor and being considered. And this is because, these officials are seeing that, communities are being exploited for corporate gain. And so, what we've seen recently is that we had a bill to do a tax credit program for the petrochemical industry, and it was widely supported by both parties. So, what we have to do is really make sure that regardless of party affiliation, is understand the power dynamics, but then also realize that regardless of party affiliation, we have to do our due diligence as citizens and hold our representatives accountable and say what we need them to do, and that they need to center our public health and well-being over corporate interests. And, I think kind of to drill in a little bit on what specifically we're doing, we are, that AG's report came out and they did make a list of recommendations. So, my colleagues and I have gotten together. So we're expanding the no drill zone. That's headed up by Representative Danielle Friel-Otten. Requiring fracking companies to publicly disclose all chemicals used in the process. And that's Rep. Dan Miller, who is leading that charge. Adding up all sources of air pollution in a given area to accurately assess air quality is Representative McCarter. And allowing Pennsylvania Office of Attorney General criminal jurisdiction over unconventional oil and gas companies, and that's another Rep. Otten bill. And then our office is working with a collaborative of environmental organizations, scientists, activists, impacted residents to close a hazardous waste loophole that exists, and that would lead to waste that's produced during the fracking process not to be stored in municipal landfills, and for them to actually have a testing plan and a plan to dispose of their waste if it meets certain criteria in a way that is far more responsible than what's happening right now. And that would lead to additional worker safety as well as placarding, so communities would know what trucks are actually transporting. So there's a number of things that have come out of that report that are being turned into action in Harrisburg, which is reassuring and no doubt making progress because of citizens using their voice and speaking up.
Well, poor children and Black and brown kids live in places where air pollution is more strong and very right in your backyard. What are you doing to protect them from this air pollution?
I'm so happy that you at the age of 10 is realizing that all of these things are so deeply, deeply interconnected. When we talk about environmental justice or racial justice or economic justice, the same word justice appears in all of those things. And if some people have really clean neighborhoods and clean streams and parks, and then a neighborhood down the street does not and is in the shadow of a frack well or a waste site or the Coke Works, for example, and there's blight and the schools aren't doing well, and those communities are filled with poor kids or Black and brown kids, we have a problem. We have a problem in the environmental movement, and because none of us can actually, our work is not done until everyone has that high quality of life and has been able to have their public health and their needs centered in policy making. And we've failed to do that in our policy making as elected officials. And I am reassured now in some ways that we actually are creating things like the Office of Environmental Justice, which lives in the DEP, and there's actually data that shows us where in Pennsylvania we have environmental justice communities and what their makeup is, as far as like race and ethnicity, as well as poverty levels. But that's just, data is just, half the battle. And it's how we use that data and what we do with that data that is actually going to make the difference. I've been so reassured that the movements that are happening are being led by young people who are fighting for climate justice. And it's so important for these young people like yourself to be, the young people like yourself in Pennsylvania to be on the forefront of our local efforts. You guys, you are going to make big things happen. And it's also going to take marching in the streets, but also meeting with your legislators to talk about these issues and make sure that they really, really get it. And that your voice is heard not only on the streets, but in front of the city county building, but also in the legislative process. We also need to remember that air quality and these environmental issues, they don't know any boundaries. Just because someone doesn't live in the community that's being polluted doesn't mean that they aren't going to be hurt downstream. So, if you are someone who does live in a more affluent community, one that doesn't have a well pad or has better air quality, our greatest strength is our solidarity and looking out for one another, because it could be any one of our communities tomorrow. That's how much power and money that these industries have. So we need to make sure that first and foremost, we're looking out for one another.
In the midst of a global pandemic, EPA Administrator Andrew Wheeler visited Pittsburgh to announce the rollback of federal methane standards for the oil and gas industry, basically allowing more methane and other harmful air pollutants to be released into the air we breathe. with new research showing breathing polluted air actually increases your risk of succumbing to the worst ravages of COVID-19. Communities of color are facing disproportionate impacts of both COVID-19 and pollution. What can states do to ensure our families are being protected from these attacks on our health and also decrease methane release?
Yeah, I would say that that was quite the surprise when Secretary Wheeler showed up just a few miles from my house to announce that. And, you know, extremely disheartening, because I think oftentimes we view regulations as stifles for business when really it spurs innovation. If your protections come from a place of protecting the public health and in the public interest, then it's a corporation's responsibility to live within those bounds and to think about what they need to innovate and what technology they need to deploy. So it is really disheartening that it's not viewed in that manner, but rather just, you know, rolled back. But the environmental movement has for too long overlooked people of color as the primary stakeholders in this mission. Rollbacks on environmental regulations over the past few years have been devastating to the progress that we've made, especially when we have a really, really, really long way to go. The good news is that the state can always choose to exceed the standards that are set by the federal government. And local agencies like Allegheny County, for example, can even do higher and more stricter regulations than the base level that the state sets. You know, that's why it's our job when we feel hopeless, when we are not in control, and we don't really have say over what's happening in the White House and in that administration, that we don't give up hope and we look to our state leaders, we look to our county leaders, maybe even our local municipal leaders, and really getting them to think about how they can strengthen regulations on industry and pollution and zoning codes and things like that that can positively impact people's lives and protect them. And, you know, that fight to protect Pennsylvania's health is not a new fight for us. My office has been working along with other legislators on these issues before the COVID-19 pandemic hit. And the pandemic has made it blatantly obvious that the intersectionality of these concerns and the increased risk for communities of color during the COVID-19 pandemic are all of these things, like I said, are like deeply, deeply interconnected. And we're going to continue to seek legislation that will address the public health crisis long faced by communities of color from harmful air pollutants. Because you have to think about, like, a lot of these communities that have been left behind, it's not just that there's a lot of pollution happening there, but if there's a lot of poverty, that means that there's a lot of people who maybe don't have health insurance or don't have jobs. And when we have that kind of crises compounding, just like many of us are experiencing maybe for the first time, that these communities have long experienced, we need to not only talk about regulations and how they pertain to the air pollution, but again, seek justice and talk about not only how we can protect the environment, but we can protect our health, safety, and well-being in its entirety.
Well, we're running out of time, but I think Gavin has one last question that he's going to ask.
Young people like me will bear the greatest impacts of climate change. When the weather is too hot, we can't play outside, and when bad air days happen, it can be hard to breathe. What are the most important ways you think we should be addressing climate change in Pennsylvania?
Oh my gosh, what a good question. So the first is connect with your elected representatives at a local, state, federal level. Call them, make sure they know you, Gavin. make sure that they are, you know, that they hear your story and they know what you care about. The other thing is to learn, keep reading, keep understanding what's going on in the world and your role in it. Sometimes it's going to be just individual actions, but sometimes it's advocating for these big changes, and you'll need to build big coalitions. So you'll also have to connect with people who are doing this work, because none of us can actually do it alone. And part of that is participating. So, you know, join a local grassroots organization, help spread awareness. I know that I work closely with, I've worked with Plein Air Council, I've worked with Center for Coalfield Justice, I've worked with Earthworks, the Breathe Project locally. And then I have a neighborhood group that is called the Tri-Borough Eco Districts that I'm a part of. And so, you know, all these people are doing good work, and it's not about shining a spotlight on what I'm doing, but rather how we're all working together collaboratively to solve these really big problems.
Thank you so much to all of you who chose to join our Moms Clean Air Force Stay In and Speak Out event today. I appreciate the help of Lois from Clean Air Council and our young voices, Odessa and Gavin. Special thanks to Representative Innamorato for being such an engaged and powerful advocate for our youngest constituents and moms to help us protect our children's health and decrease air pollution. So, good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Thanks.